Thanks for coming to Donald Thomas. My name is Oscar or Jing, whichever you prefer. I'm the coordinator of tonight's event. Tonight's event, as you know, is an interdisciplinary colloquium and discussion panel on topic of war. The reason we hold this, of course we have many reasons to do this, but there are two main reasons for this. First of all, we value the importance of interdisciplinary study. For example, when Einstein was first formulating the idea of relativity, it's not influenced by any scientific understanding, but there is human empiricism. That is a very good example. And the character of the beautiful mind, when he first formulated the game theory, is not a classical economic discourse, but a pure mathematical discovery. So we see the possibility of the study between the disciplines and how awesome that consequence can be. That's the first reason we choose that. The second reason is that, well, we always hold, by the way, tonight's event was held by the PS Philosophy and Philosophy Club, the Penn State Political Science Association, and usually the two clubs doing is hold a weekly meeting with a couple of dozens of people. And the talk is pretty casual, but the audience, the number of audience is limited by the nature of this casual discussion. And we try to make something big, which is pretty okay here. So lots of more people can come and share ideas and have nice discussion. All right, since this is different from the weekly meeting, I see lots of old members here, that we don't have a format. So first of all, the first part of the format is we have three speakers here. Dr. Schopenhauer from the History Department, and Dr. Robert Parker from the Political Science Department, and Dr. Emma I'm so sorry about that. I've tried my best to pronounce it. From the Philosophy Department. Three speakers will present around 20 minutes on the topic chosen. And after each of them present, you can roughly have 5 or 10 minutes to ask the question only for clarifications, because we will have a panel discussion later on held by the speakers have an interchange with their ideas of their own. And then it's the participant time for all of us that you can shout out the most critical comments and questions and discussions, whatever it is, to the speakers. And I think the scope of discussion is kind of increasing, and everyone should have a clear idea of what they should say before they ask questions. So I suppose the participant rate today will be around 80-ish or 100, but it's actually far less than that. So we can take a more liberal way to have a discussion after the presenting part. So anyway, we'll let the moderator then stand up. He will be the moderator of tonight's event, so I'm done with talking literally. And also we have the Mrs.
Hong.
Hong here doing the recording stuff, so you all be part of the camera show. Anyway, let's first welcome Dr. Schopenhauer to present a topic on the society at war, a historian perspective.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and thanks to the students in the Europe since 1848 class for attending, the ones from this semester and some from former semesters. Thank you guys, thank you everybody for coming out. Well, war. You know, some people grow up watching the History Channel for grainy pictures of surfacing submarines. So some people grow up fascinated by battlefields and battlefield tours, you know, real military buffs. They will know everything about rifles and uniforms. They will know everything about, specific forms of armament, shields, and equipment. And they'll be able to recount exactly the unfolding of the Battle of Borodino or the role of wireless telegraphy in the Battle of the Naval Straits of Tsushima. I am not one of those people. As anyone who even glancingly knows me professionally will be able to tell you, I am not a military historian. I'm a historian of war and society. I'm not a military historian. I come to the history of war from a completely different corner, that of a social and cultural historian. As somebody fascinated with how individual lives and life paths and the meaning that people give to their individual lives, as somebody fascinated by social relations, ongoing social relations, and how all of that then intersects with the convulsive event that is war. As someone fascinated by questions of ambition, of achievement within particular cultures at particular times, and how that intersects with war. So that's how I come to the study of war. And just to give that example of that Battle of Borodino, which, by the way, what is the Battle of Borodino? It's a battle that is fought some 90 miles west of Moscow in the context of the Napoleonic invasion of Russia. And the Russian army took a stand in front of Moscow. And it was an extraordinarily bloody battle. Estimated 250,000 participants, estimated 70,000 casualties, probably more. Inconclusive, in the sense that the Russian army had to give up that last stand, and within days the French were in Moscow. But at the same time, the Russian army never pursued the French, so did not actually. The French army never pursued the Russian army, so never really quite routed it, so you could say it was a draw. Anyway, do I come to the Battle of Borodino from a perusal of the doings of General Bagration and others? No, I come to the Battle of Borodino like several other people, having read Tolstoy's War and Peace, which offers a fantastic, brilliant description of the Battle of Borodino, in which you get a very, very good sense of what we typically call the fog of war, in which the ordinary soldier absolutely has no idea what they're doing. And at the same time, War and Peace, published in 1869, is a terrific novel because it does exactly what ideally I would like to do. Of course, I won't ever get close, but that's the kind of thing that I'd like to see people doing, namely, have a long, hard, sharp look at individual people and how they interact, and then see how that then intersects with war. And that novel, some of you may have read it. If you haven't, sign it out immediately and read it. Yes, it's a big fat book. You get a lot of letters for your money. It's worth it. I've read it 3 times, and I think I'm going to read it a couple times more before my eyes give out. And every time I discover something else in it. What it does is, it zooms out and it zooms in. Sometimes you have the big developments, you have Napoleon, you have the French army, you have Russia, you have the space, you have the time, you have serfdom. And sometimes it zooms in. You have somebody who's engaged and she's not sure that she should be engaged. Things like that. It's brilliant. And it's done in a way that feels absolutely right. You come away with something of a sense of what was at stake, and importantly, with a sense of what people felt was at stake. That for me, as a historian, is key. What did people in particular cultures, at particular moments in time, in particular societies, feel was at stake? What people felt was at stake
that's pretty much how you can sum up the program of what I do, which is the cultural history of war. And when I say the cultural history of war, I do not mean culture in the sense that it is commonly seen as, namely art, literature, and so on. I mean the word culture in its anthropological sense, that is to say, meaning an entire thought structure, and I'll give you two very humble objects, which I think conjure up a world of meaning. So on the one, this is, well, a particular object that you can buy online, and this is a business that apparently is devoted to catering to military families. It conjures up an entire world of, you could call it kitsch, you could call it sentiment, you could call it whatever you want, but it's an entire world that is conjured up by that humble garment. And here we have something different, but all equally humble, and it has come to us, you know, completely serendipitously. It's the kind of thing that normally would never have been kept. It is a field postcard written from the front by a soldier sent to his family. And this is an Austrian soldier fighting in Galicia. And he wrote that postcard, as you can see, on a slab of birch bark, because he was so taken by the kind of landscape that he saw, the birch trees and all that, that he thought, well, let's get creative and let's write this postcard home in this particular way. That again, it conjures up an entire world of wanting to be close to your family, at the same time wanting to show them what you're up to, what the landscape is like. And it's a very humble object. This was an ordinary infantry soldier who was not given to a lot of rhetoric about what he was doing. But the fact that he wrote home and that he wrote it in this particular manner on this particular object, it conjures up an entire world of meaning, a web of significance, as the cultural anthropologist Clifford Geertz would have called it. And so the notion of culture, when applied to war, is a very powerful notion, because wars are cultural events, in the sense that they mobilize more than just materials and soldiers and expertise. They involve entire thought systems, entire cultures, and they mobilize and therefore recrystallize societies, economies, social structures, cultural systems, faith, gender dynamics, and so forth. Now, it is true that some wars do that to a larger extent than others. We in the USA today, for instance, we happen to be involved in the longest cycle of wars in our history, but you wouldn't know it from looking at the Kardashians or looking at our economy, our politics, for much of what we see around us, give or take the odd shout out to our armed forces or whoever Bradley Cooper is impersonating at this moment. But by and large, this is not a society that is being recrystallized by being in the longest cycle of wars in our history. Not at all. Why is that? Because we are fighting wars much in the way that 18th century kings were fighting wars, by sending out a very small proportion of our citizenry. Today, I believe, just 0.5% of American adults is serving on active duty, which is less than at any time since the Second World War. So again, that makes it a lot like the wars that were fought by European kings, to just give that example, European kings in the 18th century, wars that were fought on the margins of the ongoing life of a society, and that could be called off almost at will, even if the aim was not achieved. And to give one example, and this is actually not from the 19th century, but from the 18th century, but from the 19th, get your centuries right. This is an example of a war of choice, namely Prussia fighting a war with Austria. Why? Well, first because they could, and second because they needed to show Austria that yes, they spoke German too, but Prussia was superior. Beyond that, they didn't want too much. So, the Prussian forces trounced the Germans at the Battle of Königgrätz, at which point the effective head of state, Prince Otto von Bismarck, was asked by his generals, so let's go on to Vienna and show them. And Bismarck said, no, I've made my point. Yes, but we can. Yes, but we're not going to. So we could call it off pretty much at will. And history is full of examples like these, but there are also other wars. Wars that can be both between states or civil wars in which the aim is not precise and finite, but the aim is infinite. The French Revolutionary Wars come to mind, Napoleon's invasion of Russia for that matter, or his invasion of Spain, which gave rise to absolute atrocities against civilians. And there's one masterpiece that comes out of it, Francisco Goya, and Tres de Mayo, which shows a massacre of civilians. Incidentally, has any of you been to the Palma Museum? There is a fantastic exhibition of etchings by Goya, Los Caprichos, right here, around the corner. Absolute masterpiece, the kind of thing that people will travel 100 kilometers to see, or maybe even 100 miles. So by all means, take those 5 steps and go to the Palma Museum. It's free. But anyway, these are wars in which the enemy is not considered an adversary, it's the enemy but equal, but as an existential threat and therefore has to be annihilated. Okay, so these wars, you can call them total wars, but it's a bit of an iffy concept, a total war, because any war is always going to fall short of total war. So I prefer the term totalizing wars. Those wars will mobilize much more of society. The army, obviously, a huge chunk of a generation, the economy, politics, and social life. These armies are these wars are convulsive events that will touch many more of the lives of contemporaries. And they generate what historians have called war culture. And war culture is a particular thought system. And I chose to illustrate it with a famous painting, Jacques-Louis David's, just right before the French Revolution, a painting depicting the oath of the Horatii brothers. And this is essentially an ode to male self-sacrifice for the patriotic cause. It depicts a scene from Roman legend. We see it in Livy, in which Rome is at war with another city, Alba, and 3 brothers in Rome pledge an oath that they are going to fight 3 brothers in the other city, so that the war may end. And we see here in the corner one woman weeping. Her name is Camilla, and she is the sister of the Horatii, but she's also married to one of the brothers on the other side. So no matter what the ending is, she is, of course, always going to be mourning somebody. It's very interesting how you see here the women collapsing, and they are portrayed sympathetically, but they're still a collapsing, incoherent heap, right? They've collapsed practically in a puddle of hormones. Whereas the men stand tall and they form this oath-swearing group. If you compare it to a painting that is, of course, extremely ambivalent towards war culture, let me just go here. Here, your sympathy goes towards the collapsing heap. The light is at the collapsing heap. And the standing tall with arms in hand, that group, well, they're the perpetrators. So it's a vision of war from a completely different side. War culture, and I'm not saying all that because I take a stand against it. I think in some cases some wars need to be fought. Let me be very clear about that. But it also means that it's going to recrystallize one's sense of public. For instance, war culture is inevitably going to generate a degree of political truce, whether it's a deeply held one or a papered over tensions, but that's what it's inevitably going to do. It's also going to change politics in the sense that, economics, in the sense that you no longer can have business as usual. Rule number one in business, namely, you buy in the cheapest markets and you sell in the dearest, is suspended. It is suspended. Profit is, by all intents and purposes, suspended. That's what happens inside a war culture. And that's how you can tell that our present wars are by no means changing our society at this point. And then the cornerstone of war culture is the notion of sacrifice, is the notion that the individual interest must take a back seat vis-à-vis the good of the public, vis-à-vis the public good. Whether that means actual blood sacrifice, people giving themselves up to risk life and limb, or whether it simply means foregoing profit, any kind of profit, monetary profit, political profit, any kind of profit, it doesn't matter. But the cornerstone of war culture is the notion that the public good has the right to demand something from the individual citizen, and that something is hallowed by the name sacrifice. So, in other words, sacrifice is the cornerstone of war culture. And now what the new generation of cultural historians are looking at more than anything is precisely war culture, its limits, its extent, its limits, its manifestations. And let me give you some examples from my own field, which is the First World War. And the First World War is particularly interesting for cultural history, partly because it actually did generate some magnificent high culture and low culture, but if you're looking at Picasso or Apollinaire or the war poets or anyone, but particularly because it is a war which was so horrendous to be fought, and in which the participants, up until the very last day, had a very strong sense of what they were fighting for, but then within practically months afterwards, nobody could quite remember what it was for. So it's an extremely good case study for the study of war culture. And so I'm going to now give you a few examples of recent books that I've put out. One example, which is wonderful, by my colleague Chantal Das, who teaches at King's College in London, is a compendium of scholarship on race and empire and writing about the First World War, whether it is middle-class ladies in Mumbai or whether it's Senegalese soldiers. There's all manner of things in there, expectations for the future, thinking about the body, thinking about power relations, thinking about coercion. It's wonderful, it's absolutely trailblazing stuff. Another very recent example is by Isabel Hull, one of the absolute top historians of modern Europe, who teaches at Cornell University. And her latest book investigates the question of international law during the First World War. And she starts out by saying, well, for the longest time, we are so used to calling that war absurd. It was about nothing. that we forget that for the people involved, it was to a very large extent about international law. Who was breaking it? How could it be restored? And it really matters. And if you read that book, and you keep reading, it's an extraordinarily dense, erudite book. But at some point, you say to yourself, wow, you know, what you're looking at every evening on the news going on in Donetsk, well, what this book tells you has a lot of bearing on that. If I may be so vain as to... so this is my latest book that came out, in which I use the history of a young woman who is fairly unknown. Her name was Gabrielle Petit, and she was literally the girl from nowhere. She was an orphan, a school dropout. She made a living any which way, you know, selling fur one day, waiting tables the next, bitterly unhappy. And the war offered her a chance. She became a spy. This was in German-occupied France and Belgium. She started to spy for the British, and it gave her a chance. She felt that finally she could use her intelligence in secret intelligence. But of course, there was a huge risk involved, and she perished. She was arrested, interrogated, and then finally executed at the age of 23. And I used the story not so much as a story of spying, although I have a chapter about spying and counter-spying in there, but I use it mainly to unlock what's going on when you look at an individual life, how it intersects with the war. I try to look at achievement and visions of achievement. I try to look at social structure. I try to look at ambition. And I also look at memory, because when she died, nobody knew of her fate. When the war ends, she lies unremembered in an unmarked grave on the outskirts of the city. But then she's dug up, both literally, because she's being reburied in a huge ceremony, and figuratively, she becomes an epitome of something. And I try to uncover of what. So you have a whole cycle of memory, which at some point is extraordinarily intense, especially in the 1920s. There's movies made about her, there's monuments. These are really the first monuments dedicated to a working class young woman in European history, and to the best of my knowledge in all of, pretty much in all of modern history. And I really use that to unlock what is going on in this war with individual lives. A couple of other examples. There's a wonderful book that just came out. Actually, I had a slide of it, but you'll just have to take my word for it, which is called The First World War in 100 Objects by Gary Sheffield's, and which basically takes a lot of humble objects in the same way that I took this postcard and this undergarment, and it tries to tell the story of the war through those objects. Another field of inquiry, which is extremely promising, is the body history of war. It's literally the history of not just wounded veterans, but the history of wounds. What did particular arms do to the body, to nerves, to muscle, to skin, to organs? And how can we start comprehending how an entire society lives with that as it goes on? What are the sources that you can use for this? Well, they are manifold and multifarious. They can be objects, they can be what we call ego documents, which is diaries and letters. They can be, of course, official documents. We shouldn't chuck those. They can be photos, posters, paintings, drawings. They can be monuments, they can be war graves, they can be arms, they can be all manner of things. Methods. Well, actually, it's pretty unfortunate because this kind of relies on a slide, but never mind. Our methods that we use for that kind of thing can range from the serial, where we really, because we do use big data. I mean, it's not because we are cultural historians of war that we can't stand data. We can. I mean, we're not the kind of people that go like, oh, that's a lot. I don't know what to do with this. I used to teach statistics. That was actually my first job. So there. In case anybody thinks I'm a wimp, my first job was teaching statistics. So I know about that stuff. And I came away with it thinking that sometimes you need to use statistics, and sometimes it's just not going to add too much to what you do. Sometimes you can do one really robust case study and get into the nitty-gritty and just say, is this representative? Maybe not, but it is representative in itself. I mean, it tells the story in itself. But sometimes you're going to have to look at quantitative data, and you're going to have to look at serial things. One example is war monuments, where sometimes you really need to take them as a whole, like say the 30,000 war monuments that went up in France after World War I, in every single little village, municipality, everywhere, 30,000 of them. And it is really rewarding to have a look at them as a whole. How many of them have pacifist themes? It's one thing that you can see. How many of them have gung-ho themes? How many of them have religious themes? And so on. So that is a very rewarding avenue of inquiry. But then at other moments, it is very rewarding, and I've actually done that quite recently, to look at one war monument and its creator, and to take a really long look at how that came about, why it took the form that it took, why it became iconic, and so on. War monuments, that's one example. Another example of how you can be serial when you have to be, and idiosyncratic when you have to be, is things like child mortality in war. Obviously, you're going to need your demographic data. That's one. You really need those. But then there are other things. What does it mean? What does it mean? How does it impact people's lives? And for that, you're going to have to look at things like funeral objects or diaries, photos, and so forth. So, serial where appropriate, idiosyncratic where appropriate. And in terms of theorizing, and that is my last point, what kind of theorizing are you going to come up with? Well, you're not going to come up with the theorizing, and here I quote an older book by the great historical sociologist Charles Tilly, which was called Big Structures, Large Processes, Huge Comparisons. It's a wonderful little essay, in which he argues that the ultimate unit of human social life, and also the ontological foundation of social analysis, is the social relation, a repeated interaction between two or more people. And that you have to start from there, and that you have to analyze that very carefully, and that you have to be empirical. And that you have to be, and I mean, it almost seems like a no-brainer, but people make that mistake a lot, that you cannot compare things that are not alike. A war in the 18th century is not a war in the 20th century, unless you're going to look at specific things. Percentage of mobilized, for instance. Type of war aims. But you can't just take wars and compare them. You have to really ground very carefully. You have to do historically grounded analysis, and time matters. The passing of time matters. Changes in technology, changes in expectations, they matter. So you avoid the huge comparisons, you avoid the large processes, you avoid the big structures, but you do generalize. But how do you generalize? You generalize at the medium level, at the mid-level. You work with medium-level generalizations, with dynamics, not so much with what, but with how. How does something happen? How does mobilization happen? How does war financing happen? Things like that. You work with, I mean, there's many exciting new things that come up, such as, for instance, the study of temporalities, in which you use time not as the backdrop of your work, but the object of your work. You foreground time. So you try to see what people's expectations are for their own lives, for the society in which they live or the group, for their descendants. What are their expectations? How do they look at the past? How do they situate themselves? And how does that change in warfare? How does that change, for instance, in the face of clear danger? What is the time experience of soldiers? Typically the time experience of soldiers is going to be, you live in the here and now, you take it one day at a time, but at the same time, you have these incredibly inflated expectations of a time when everything will be made right. You call that eschatology. So anyway, temporalities, that is a great field of what I would call medium-level generalizations, in which you look not so much at the what, but at the how. And once you do that, you have developed a conceptual toolbox that I think you can take places. So, thank you very much.
Well, tonight I'm going to talk about war from the standpoint of the Correlates of War project. As the previous speaker said, there are a number of scholars who look at war in terms of quantitative databases. Well, at the Correlates of War, we're the ones who actually provide a lot of the data. And the Correlates of War is a project that was founded at the University of Michigan some 50 years ago, about 52 years ago. And it compiles data on all wars that have occurred since the end of the Napoleonic Wars. So again, all wars since 1816. So when we talk about war, first we come up with a number of definitions. Well, first, what is war, in particular interstate war? And this is the official Correlates of War definition. Interstate war is a sustained combat between the regular armed forces of two internationally recognized states in which there are 1,000 or more battle fatalities. And notice the components of that definition. First, sustained combat. So it is not a case where you would have some intermittent fighting, fighting here and then no fighting for a number of months and then fighting again. No, sustained combat. And again, between the regular armed forces. Regular armed forces. So this takes away from, let's say, the use of irregulars, guerrilla warfare. That's covered in another definition. Again, the regular armed forces of two internationally recognized states. So a major component in the definition of war is, in fact, the definition of states. Again, states go to war because war is the ultimate act of states. Well, what is a state? Well, you have to have international recognition because, again, it is that relational component of war. One state going to war against another. And also 1,000 or more battle fatalities. Well, the reason why that is used as a cutoff is because we notice that there are a number of conflicts where there are, let's say, 500 or so, a few hundred people who may be killed. And then there are a few conflicts where you have massive numbers of fatalities. So 1,000 came out to be a nice cutoff in a basically bimodal distribution of casualties. So again, the definition of interstate war. So one aspect of war that has been throughout history is the role of uncertainty, and I'll talk a little bit about that over the next few minutes. And this uncertainty, we can go back to the Peloponnesian War and about how fear of the future, of future change and power could lead to war. I believe Thucydides famously said it was the change in capabilities, the rise of Athenian power and fear that caused that helped to contribute to war. So in terms of the study of war, there are different ways in which political scientists study war. One, there are historical case studies, which as the previous speaker mentioned. Historical case studies are very important because they illuminate some major theoretical issues. So just looking at a war like World War I. So for instance, back when I was in graduate school, I looked at World War I from the standpoint of offensive military doctrines and how the adoption of offensive military doctrines led to increases in the likelihood of war. It was called the cult of the offensive, and how that idea actually increased the likelihood of war. Why? Because of fear that if you did not strike first, the other side would get the first strike and they would end up winning. So in many ways, war, that is the Longino War, was almost defensive. This notion of preemption. Preempt before the other side hits you. Then, as I mentioned, quantitative approaches, which are data-based. And the correlates of war provides a lot of data about different types of wars, number of battle fatalities, quantitative also in terms of militarized interstate disputes. Because while war, 1,000 more fatalities, we know that there are a number of conflicts that would not reach the level of war. Those are militarized interstate disputes. And then there are different types of disputes. Is it a threat? Is it a show of force? Is it a use of force that is short of war? Also, and this moves away somewhat from correlates of war, the use of rational choice and formal models. This is important in terms of looking at bargaining behavior in war. Why do states go to war in terms of decision-making approaches? This has been influenced heavily by economics. Many of the models looking at rational choice in war have been developed in economics. So one of the first things the correlates of war did when it was created was to build a war typology to help us compare and contrast various wars that have occurred throughout history. So again, building a typology. Well, again, we have interstate war, as I just mentioned, sustained combat, regular armed forces to a more internationally recognized states. But in addition to interstate war, there's intrastate war. And intrastate war, there's more than one type. So in intrastate war, we have civil wars. In civil wars, you can have a civil war for central control, meaning that you have two or more rival militaries fighting for control of the existing state. But in addition to that type of civil war for central control, you can have a civil war over local issues, which would include secession. Sometimes you have rebels who are fighting to secede, to break away from an existing state. And there have been many secessionist movements and secessionist wars across history, and even today, especially when states aren't viewed as being legitimate by all of their citizens. Then there are regional internal wars, which tend to be local but not national forces involved. So fighting in a particular province or area of a country. And then there are intercommunal wars, where no state forces are involved. So notice where all the others, you have some type of state force, be it federal or local force involved against civilians, if you will, in terms of civil war. In intercommunal, you have two groups who are fighting that happen to be civilians. So it could be a riot, it could be a massacre. So again, conflict that does not involve state forces, intercommunal. So all of those civil wars that are both over central control as well as secessionists, regional, internal, and intercommunal, all of those are intrastate wars. So we have interstate and then intrastate. And then there's another category called extrastate war, which is sort of disappearing. But what extrastate war involves, well, there are two categories there, colonial and imperial. Colonial and imperial. Imperial wars occur when the imperial power goes in to take over a colony. So again, a state versus a non-state. State versus a non-state. So when the British took on the Zulus, for instance, the Zulus were not recognized as a state. Britain went and took them over. Extra state. Colonial war, on the other hand, is a state versus a colonial possession. So, for instance, when the Portuguese fought against the MPLA in UNITA and Angola, in the War of Angolan Independence between 1961 and 75, that's an example of colonial war. So we have imperial wars and we have colonial wars. Next category, non-state war. Non-state because It could be in non-state territory or across state borders. Well, that leads to the question, what is a non-state? A non-state is a political entity that is not internationally recognized. So, for instance, we could have non-state war if it involves, well, there's some states like Transnistria, or a state like South Ossetia, a state like Abkhazia. These are states that exist in the former Soviet Union that lacks international recognition, except perhaps by the Russians and maybe each other. Okay. So again, that would fall into the category of non-state war. And then a final category is internationalized civil war. And this is the category where you have a civil war that is going on, and then you have outside powers coming in. So it's somewhat of a hybrid, and two great examples there, Vietnam and Afghanistan. Indeed, Afghanistan encompasses many types of wars, in that it was at one point an interstate war. It was also an intra-state war, fighting for control of the existing state. It's been somewhat intercommunal. But in general, it is an internationalized civil war. And this category has actually been increasing over time. And the reason for that is many of the civil wars that we see in the world oftentimes bring in major powers and also regional powers. For instance, what is happening in Yemen today, that's an example of an internationalized civil war. And if we take a look over time, especially since, I would say, World War II, we've seen an increase in the number of internationalized civil wars. So, I've already mentioned militarized interstate disputes, which are fighting below the level of war. Again, show of force, use of force short of war. So what do we know about war? Because really, the purpose of putting all this data together was to look at, well, what leads to war? Well, in the correlates of war, we look at war onsets and we also look at war duration. Most of the studies have been on war onset, what leads to the start of war. But increasingly, there's been attention given to duration. Why do some wars last longer than others? There are some wars, especially intrastate wars, that have lasted for off and on 50 years, 50, maybe even 60 years. Indeed, in the class earlier today, I talked about the Shans and the Kachins and the Karens, which happen to be three ethnic groups in the country of Burma or Myanmar. And these groups have been fighting off and on for nearly 60 years. And we can go on to various other conflicts around the globe, many of which haven't gotten much attention in the United States, but really horrific conflicts in South Asia, Southeast Asia, parts of Sub-Saharan Africa. So, another approach to looking at war, so the correlates of war looks at data and is more quantitative, building data sets. There's also those who look at war from the standpoint of rational choice. And rational choice, which comes from economics, the basis of that is cost-benefit analysis, meaning that states go to war if the benefits of going to war exceeds the cost. Well, the benefits of going to war is that, well, you're able to defeat your opponent, you're able to get rid of a, quote, existential threat, you're able to expand the territory that you control. Let's say those are the benefits. Well, the cost of war is that, well, war is costly in terms of materiel, in terms of casualties. So the question becomes one of, well, why do states go to war? What is the level of cost that will lead leaders to say, although I would love to go to war, although I would love to take over that territory, although I would love to take over that strategic choke point, I'm not willing to pay the price to do so. So again, what leads to that type of thinking? Well, in this section of the study of war, we get into bargaining behavior. Bargaining, because in many ways, international politics is all about bargaining. It's about also deterrence and coercion. What is deterrence? Deterrence is trying to dissuade someone from doing something you don't want them to do. Are are you attacking my friend? No, I want to make sure that you continue not to attack my friend. And one way of doing so is, well, if you attack my friend, I will hit you. Although you may not like my friend, although you may love to punch my friend, you're not willing to take the punch from me, which is the cost if you take the offending action. And that's what deterrence is about. But then there is coercion, which is something quite different. Coercive diplomacy. Coercion involves changing your behavior. You're currently doing something I don't want you to do, and I'm trying to get you to change your behavior. Well, how do I do that? One way is through inflicting pain. And that's a large part of what war is about, the inflicting of pain or the threat of inflicting pain in order to induce someone else to change their behavior. Now the question becomes one of, well, assume that war is costly. How do I get someone to avoid doing something that I don't want them to do, or to get them to change their behavior from something that they're currently doing? Well, I have to convince them that I am willing to inflict pain upon them. Because remember, going to war is costly for me as well. It's costly for you, but it's also costly for me. So I would love to simply say, well, don't do so-and-so, and whack my finger and get you to change your behavior. I would love to do that. But you may not believe me. You may say, oh, well, Packer is engaged in cheap talk. That's a political science term, cheap talk. So how can I convince you that my threat is not cheap talk? Well, I have to send a costly signal. A costly signal. I mobilize. Mobilization is a costly signal. Why? Because it costs a lot of money. I have to take troops off their regular routine, mobilize them, doing all of that, get everyone all upset. That's costly. But it sends a signal of my resolve. And perhaps I can get you to change your behavior. But then again, you still may not believe me. Oh, well, he's doing that, but I still don't believe he's willing to go to war. So sometimes going to war, or at least the initial moves in war, sends the signal to the other side of the resolve of the first to say, yes, I am willing to do this in order to stop you. And perhaps the fighting can stop fairly quickly. Perhaps. Because if fighting does not stop quickly, it tends to go on for a longer period of time. Because war takes on its own dynamic. That's the reason why we have to take a look at war onset, but then also war duration. So, a large part of what I was just talking about is lack of information over the adversary's resolve. I know that if you're resolved, I'm not going to attack your friend. I'm not going to attack you because I know your resolve. But suppose I don't know your resolve. If I don't know, then we may have to fight in order for that information to be revealed. So again, war is a very costly way of gaining information. And that's one of the arguments made by those who look at rational choice and bargaining behavior. So again, cheap talk versus costly signals. Another issue has to be, it is one of separation of types. Separation of types. That is, I don't know what type of actor you happen to be if you're making friends. I don't know what type of actor you are. And generally speaking, there are, and again, I'm simplifying just a bit, there are two major types of actors. Rational opportunists and paranoid victims. Well, first, what is a rational opportunist? A rational opportunist is someone who would take advantage of supposed weakness. That is, if you believe that I am not particularly resolved, that, oh, Packer will not actually fight if I hit his friend or invade his neighbor, he's not going to fight. If you believe I'm not resolved, you will take advantage of that. However, if you believe that I am resolved, that I will go to war in order to stop you, you will back off. That means you're a rational opportunist. So, based upon cost-benefit analysis, you go to war. You go to war because you believe no one will stop you. However, if you believe someone will stop you, you will not go to war. Rational opportunists. And by the way, it's against rational opportunists that deterrence work. That's what deterrence is all about. I'm going to raise the cost on you of going to war, and as a result, I can deter you from going to war. Well, there's a problem, however. Suppose that you're not a rational opportunist, but rather a paranoid victim. A paranoid victim. Well, what's a paranoid victim? Well, a paranoid victim is someone who happens to have certain fears. They fear that if they don't go to war, if they don't attack, if they don't advance somehow, they may be taken advantage of. If they don't take that territory, I will, and they will be put at a weakened position. If they don't go to war, I will continue to disrespect them. Again, paranoid victims believe that they're not getting necessary respect in the international system. They believe that they themselves may be the target of an attack. Therefore, they engage in belligerent behavior in order to prepare for what they believe will be an attack on them. So, part of what foreign policy happened to be, and remember, war is the ultimate act of states, therefore the ultimate act of foreign policy, is trying to determine what type of adversary you're dealing with. Are you dealing with a rational opportunist? And if you are, then you should engage in hardline toughness, because we know that rational opportunists will back down in the face of toughness. However, if you're dealing with a paranoid victim, perhaps you should act nice. Because remember, if you act tough with the paranoid victim believes that you're about to attack them. So if you act tough, then they could say, okay, yes, I knew he was about to attack me, I better hit him first. So you have to know what type of adversary you're dealing with. So what does all of this entail? It goes back to information. Wars are the result of lack of information, which is the key insight developed, made popular by James Farron, who wrote an article, The Rationalist Explanations for War. Okay? War is a result of lack of information. And then I'll also mention here the use of strategic bombing and the infliction of pain. Strategic bombing. Well, we know there is bombing. You bomb the military assets of the other side, so that they're not capable of continuing the war. That's one way of bombing. Strategic bombing, on the other hand, is you're not targeting the other side's capability to fight. You're targeting their willingness to fight. You're trying to crack their resolve. You're trying to destroy their morale. You want to break them. That's what strategic bombing is about. Strategic bombing is an idea that developed just prior to World War II, and then was first implemented during World War II, bombing cities. The London Blitz, the bombing of Dresden, the Tokyo break-ins. All of that had to do with strategic bombing. You're attacking the ability of your adversary to continue to fight by attacking the soft underbelly of your adversary, which happens to be their civilian population. So going back to the notion of total war in terms of taking the war directly to the citizens. The idea being that by destroying society or threatening to destroy society, the people will rise up against the regime, and perhaps that will end the war. One other point about the infliction of pain. If you attack a city, you don't attack the entire city. You don't level an entire city necessarily. Let's say you bomb about half of it. Some of you wonder, why bomb half of it? You bomb half of it in order to demonstrate I have the ability to do so, and if the other half of the people do not surrender, I'm coming after them. So you always want to leave something left untouched so you can come back and hit them again. That's the infliction of pain. Notice the psychological aspect of this. Again, strategic bombing. I can always come back and I can inflict more pain. So do you really want to continue to oppose me? Or do you want more pain? Now, this notion of how to get others to back down and change their behavior, there's rational choice, and then there's an alternative to rational choice analysis. We call this prospect theory. Prospect theory. And prospect theory, in large part, it is based upon this notion of domain of gain and domain of loss. What does that mean? Well, it refers to risk-taking behavior. So, oftentimes, leaders may take a risk in order to achieve a possible gain or to avoid a certain loss. So again, if you're taking a risk to achieve a possible gain, you're in the domain of gains. To avoid a certain loss, you're in the domain of loss. Why is this important? It's important because if you're in the domain of loss, you can increase the cost on the adversary to the point where they may say, I'm not going to take that risk. I'm not going to take that risk. Even though I may gain from it, I'm not going to take it. I'm fairly satisfied where I'm at now. Obviously, I would love to do even better than where I'm at now, but I'm okay now. If opportunity presents itself, I will take that gain, but it's costly, I'll back off. Deterrence will work there. Coercion should work. But what about the adversary who's in the domain of loss, where they're taking risk in order to avoid the certainty of loss? They know if they do nothing, they're at a suboptimal point. They're at a point where they're less, the reference point, the status quo, is below their reference point. They don't like the place where they are right now. They believe that they're being disrespected. They believe they could be much greater than what they currently are. They believe that they're in a position of weakness. And they're taking a risk in order to get out of that position of weakness. If that is the case, then deterrence-type policies and threats may not work. They're willing to take a risk in order to avoid the certainty of a loss. So again, when you're faced with an adversary who happen to have certain aspirational goals, you may end up with deterrence failure. And this takes us to the notion of status quo versus revisionist states. There are some states that would like to maintain the status quo. They like the way things are now. They're satisfied. But then there are others that are dissatisfied. They're revisionists. And if they're revisionist enough, they're willing to go to war in order to change the current situation. And those states are very difficult to contain. You have to understand what type of adversary you're dealing with. There are some adversaries, well, accommodation may work. You may say, well, if you act nice, you can get these rewards. There are some adversaries that will not work at all. Once again, knowing whom you're facing. And then what about from your standpoint? Suppose you get into a war. You think, this will be an easy war. First of all, no one goes into a war believing the war will be long and costly. Everyone assumes when they decide to go to war, it will be short and low cost. Well, suppose what happens is that you go into a war and all of a sudden it's long, it's costly, you have casualties, massive amounts of money being spent, you're not advancing much, but you sunk all of those costs in the war. Can you just withdraw? Can you just say, it's not working out, let's leave? What about all those lives lost? How many of you have heard, well, they had not died in vain? How many times have you heard that? And again, who's going to be the leader who admits, oops, I made a mistake? Who's going to say that? First of all, any leader that says, oops, I made a mistake, what will happen in the next election? They're gone. So, leaders looking at these sunk costs, they don't just withdraw. Instead, they engage in something called strategic withdrawal. This is what happened in Vietnam. This is what happened in Saudi Iraq. That's what's happening in Afghanistan today. When you're involved in a long, costly war, you don't just pick up and leave. Because picking up and leave means that, the war was a mistake. And if the war was a mistake, that means leaders are incompetent. No leader wishes to be viewed as being incompetent in the eyes of the people. Therefore, this had to be a strategic withdrawal. We're going to slowly withdraw. We're going to bomb while we're withdrawing. Why? Because we want to show the enemy, no, we're not cutting and running. This is orderly. And what happens is that sometimes you lose more soldiers in withdrawal than you are in the initial fighting of the war. We know, for instance, in terms of Vietnam. Everyone knew by the time that Lyndon Johnson announced he was not running for re-election in March of 1968, the Vietnam War was basically lost. From a political standpoint, the Tet Offensive, when Walter Cronkite, the most trusted man in America, went against the war. So everyone said, oh, okay, the Vietnam War cannot be won. But then, did President Johnson need to pull out the troops? Did President Nixon, who succeeded President Johnson, did he pull out the troops? All of a sudden, no. It took President Nixon until the 1972 campaign to finally take the American troops out. And the last POWs to leave left in January of 1973. Why did it take so long? Because no one wanted to be the person to say, we made a mistake and we have to pull out, strategic withdrawal. Now, what's the problem with that? We know that in the Vietnam War, there was roughly, I believe, something like 26,000 Americans who had been killed up until 1968. Between March of 1968 and the final American withdrawal in 1973, we know another 30,000 Americans were killed. More Americans were killed in the strategic withdrawal than in actually full prosecution of the war. And I believe similar stats exist for Iraq and Afghanistan as well. This suggests that domestic politics is very important. And the next one I mentioned here, reputation and domestic audience costs. Domestic audience costs. Because when you go to war, or fighting a war, there are two audiences. There's the audience of the adversary, but then there is your own domestic population. And you want to be viewed as being tough. Why? Because having a reputation of toughness is viewed as a good thing. And actually, from a marketing standpoint, it is. Because if you have a reputation for toughness, would-be opportunists will not cross you. If you have a reputation for weakness, would-be opportunists would. So having a reputation of toughness could actually reduce the number of wars that you have to fight. But it also puts you in the box where you have to take on more hardline positions in order to demonstrate how tough you are. Sometimes you threaten the use of war. And I will say, and this is jumping ahead just a bit, that point I mentioned at the bottom, major versus minor powers. We know major powers are far more likely to go to war than minor powers. Why? Because major powers have reputations to protect. Minor powers generally do not. Minor powers only go to war when the country itself is being directly attacked. Major powers, they have a reputation that they have to defend. So sometimes states go to war, not because, well, the country is being attacked. No, they go to war because we have to protect our reputation so that no one will perhaps attack us or our allies in the future. Oh, another point about major powers. Major powers have allies. Major powers have interests that must be defended around the world. That is the reason why major powers end up going to war. By the way, this is the principal reason why there are a number of libertarians who argue we need to go back to Washington's farewell address. Washington said that we should avoid entangling alliances with Europe. Because by having alliances, you create new commitments. And when you have new commitments, you have to defend those commitments. When you have to defend commitments, that means you're more likely to go to war. Why must you go to war? In order to demonstrate your resolve. So, in addition to the question of what type of actor you're dealing with, there's another question which has to do with what I call the shadow of the future. Will promises be kept? Making agreements potentially is easy. Well, we agree to this and you agree to that. But the question is, any agreement signed today, will it be lived up to tomorrow? Will it be? Especially if there's a change in relative capabilities between the two actors. If I am weak and you are strong, and we agree, we come up with some type of agreement, well, you agree you will do so and so and so. Well, I'm weak. Sure, I'll sign off on that. However, over time, I'm gaining in capabilities. I'm agreeing to that treaty because I'm too weak to stop it. What happens when I get stronger? Will I still live up to that agreement, or will I try to overturn it? But then you have to decide, will Packer keep his word? Will he keep his word? So again, agreements made today will be lived up to tomorrow. And if you do not believe that the agreement will be lived up tomorrow, you may not make that agreement today. Which goes back to, well, what are you doing? Are you dealing with some type of rational opportunists who will take advantage of the change in relative capabilities, and perhaps once conditions change, changes in relative power, the adversary may attack. And this takes us to what we call preventive war. Preventive war. You go to war not because conditions today may merit war. You go to war because you believe conditions tomorrow may be so bad, and the adversary may be such a revisionist, it is far better to go to war today when you know you have a chance to win than to risk going to war tomorrow when the adversary may be in position to defeat you. And by the way, we're seeing a clear case of the possibility of preventive war. The Israelis are arguing that the Iranians are dangerous revisionists who are out to destroy Israel. Now, is Iran in the position to destroy Israel today? No. But what happens once Iran acquire a nuclear weapon? Will the Iranians be reticent, or will the Iranians be a bit more aggressive? Now, hardliners in Israel are arguing, well, the Iranians are bent upon aggression, therefore, preventive war becomes an option. So again, the shadow of the future. Another issue that has gained a lot of attention in the study of war is regime time. Does democracy make a difference? Is there a difference between how democracies behave versus autocracies? One argument says democracies in general are more peaceful than non-democracies. And others say, well, democracies are no more peaceful than non-democracies, but democracies do not fight one another. So that's one aspect. Another is democratic winning percentage. We know, for instance, that democracies tend to win most of the wars that they fight if the war is short enough. Meaning that if wars go beyond something on the order of around, let's say, a war that goes beyond a couple of years, the likelihood of the democracy winning goes down dramatically. And that's because democracies suffer from casualty aversion. Casualty aversion. Meaning that when casualties go up, support for the war goes down. And to the extent that democratic leaders need to support the people in order to fight a war, if casualties go up, then, support for the war go down, the anti-war protests in the Vietnam War being handed down. Meaning that when democracies go to war, they have to win the war quickly and at low cost. And then, I guess two other issues I would like to mention in wrapping up. One is rivalry and conflict. Rivalry. Because we know that, and I mentioned here, disproportionately recurrent conflict between rivals. Meaning that there are far more wars between countries considered rivals than any other two countries. Why? Because there's a history there. There's a context there. India and Pakistan. Israel and Egypt until the Camp David Accords. Rivalry. And the thing about rivalry, bringing domestic politics back into it, what happens if you say, well, we've been rivals with this other country for a long time, maybe we ought to extend a hand of friendship to them. Hardliners in the country will eat that combination of alive. You have to take a look at the role of domestic politics when you're talking about war. And then the final point I would like to bring up, and again, if you have questions on any of these, I'm more than happy to talk. I'm restraining myself tonight. Parity versus preponderance. Parity versus preponderance. And here, the subtitle there, was the Cold War truly bipolar? And I would argue no. I would argue no. Now, of course, many of you heard, well, it's bipolar, the United States and the Soviet Union. Well, I leave you with this. The United States have fleets all over the world, in the Atlantic, in the Pacific, in the Mediterranean, in the Indian Ocean. All over the world. Where was, Soviet Union no longer exists, where was the Soviet Blue Water Navy? Where was their Blue Water Navy? And even where the Soviets had their surface fleets. You had the Northern Fleet of Murmansk. But in order to get into the Atlantic, those ships had to go through the gap between Greenland, Iceland, and the UK, all NATO members. Or the Pacific Fleet of Vladivostok that had to go through the Tsushima Straits between Japan and South Korea. Or the Black Sea Flotilla in Sevastopol in Crimea, why Crimea is so important. But of course, they would have to go through the Turkish Straits, and the Baltic Fleet in Kaliningrad had to go through the Danish Straits. Again, all NATO members. The Soviet Union was basically boxed in. The United States had troops all over the world. Where did the Soviet Union have large numbers of troops during the Cold War outside of areas that immediately bordered the Soviet Union? Afghanistan bordered the Soviet Union, don't forget. So from the standpoint of the Cold War, really, it was the United States being the dominant country in the world, and the Soviet Union was challenging it. And it was an unsuccessful challenge. Again, how would one look at world politics? Okay, I know I probably have run it over, so perhaps I will stop now. And again, if you have questions on any of this, including arms race behavior, offense, defense, which goes back to World War I, again, I'll be happy to take any further questions.
I want to tell something extremely simple in this very brief presentation on non-violent voices, arguments against war. Followers of Jainism, Taoism, Marxism, and Menshevism have all been lovers of peace in their own ways. I want to show that the essential sources of their teachings, concepts, are ahimsa, non-injury, no harm, uve, non-action, and the Tao, which were brilliant innovations and which are not only relevant today, but most needed. I will sketch briefly the similarities and dissimilarities of their views of pacifism, just war, and revolution. Jainism stood out as a philosophy from the start in promoting non-harm, non-injury, and the concept of ahimsa, but simultaneously advocated tolerance on the grounds that no one holds the absolute truth, and everyone has his or her own relative standpoint of views. Let's see how Jainism arrived at these positions. Jainism, as a philosophical movement, appeared before or around the same time as Taoism, Marxism, and Menshevism. But the development of Jainism and other Indian philosophical schools were markedly different in their historic background. India was not plunged into civil war as China for several hundred years, but the Indian state was affected by movements against the ruling state policy, which enforced the supremacy of the Brahmin class and its philosophy with an iron fist. Jainism sprang up as a reaction against the ruling Brahmin philosophy, which is a philosophy of priesthood. Priests were above even the ruling society in India. Jainism as a philosophy of non-violence re-emerged as a full-fledged philosophy during the life of Mahavira. Jainism as a philosophy and teaching weren't recognized by the West until recently Jainism was considered to be an offshoot of Buddhism, but the Jainist concept of ahimsa had enormous influence on other Indian schools, as Western scholarship came to realize in the past few decades. Jainism core principles of non-violence, non-injury, or ahimsa is based on overall Jainist social-philosophical, social-political worldview. Jainists believe that the universe comprises two kinds of reality, the living and non-living. According to them, living beings include not only human beings, but the smallest insects, plants, reptiles, and birds. On the other end of the spectrum are non-living objects, which the living beings require for their purposes. Jainism states that each living being has a soul called jiva, and non-living beings, which is lack of soul, are called ajiva. Because each living being has a soul, jiva, you can't harm a living beings, even the smallest insects. This Jainist teachings is called realistic and relativistic pluralism. Jainists hold that reality consists of manifoldness or manyness. Jainist ontology is known as anikantavada, or the manifoldness of reality. Jainism says that reality possesses innumerable qualities. An object possesses an infinite number of characteristics. Ordinary people cannot comprehend all the qualities of all things. People can know only some qualities. Jain metaphysics is relativistic pluralism. Jain ontology is a relativistic in the sense that no statement or standpoint can claim to be absolute. All truths are relative to others. Any standpoint or statement can be only partially true. Human knowledge is relative and limited regarding the innumerable characteristics of an object. This worldview is considered to be an ethical extension of the Jain ethical imperative of ahimsa, or non-harm, into the field of philosophy as a form of tolerance and relativity. This argument goes as follows. At the center of Jain logic lie two interrelated methods, Nyayavada, or the methods of seven standpoints, and Theravada, or the method of sevenfold predications. The former involves showing that any statement can be of any limited validity, not absolute validity, because it can be contextualized. The second method involves the recognition that there are only a limited number of possible types of statements that one can make about an object: positive attribution, negative attribution, or inexpressibility. By combining these two methods, the Jains developed a logic according to which any statement is at best representative of a single perspective. In contrast, the Jains argue the adoption of all possible points of view in more global approach from multiple perspectives anikanta. Therefore, Jainism prescribes that we should not hurt others, we should not kill any life, we should not do harm in any life, because all life has equal rights on this earth. And as human beings, we must understand that if you kill any living things, you kill a soul. Whenever the Jains talks about ethics, they talk about the duty of human being. They say that the highest and best duty of human being is to appreciate non-violence and to practice non-violence, recognizing that the essential future of all life, including our own, is soul. Humans do not need to communicate with animals and know their language to know that they do not want to be eaten. In Jain philosophy, non-eating of animals results from the recognition of one's shared jiva, soul, rather than any specific situation or interaction where the merits of such non-eating are understood. It is wrong to harm sentient creatures, even in a case when such harm will result on overriding good. One strives not only toward lessening harm, one strives toward complete non-harm. Thus, not only do giants recognize that we share our planet with animals and in many ways have co-evolved and live intimately lives, they try to avoid being in their way as much as possible due to the actual and potential harm of such shared co-presence. The impossibility of avoiding such harmful contact with animals does not negate the ethical imperative that one can and should try. After all, we do organize everyday life around trying not to harm other human beings as much as possible. So that's it. Now let's turn our attention to Daism. We are familiar with the founders of either Jainism or Daism, but only know legends and mystical stories. Philosophical and political teachings were written and compiled by later followers. We know that Taoist monks translated Buddhist works and that Buddhism, like other Indian philosophies, was influenced by the concept of ahimsa and non-injury. But their ideas of non-violence are different. Their reasons for opposing war and favoring non-violence were the result of the historical context. Taoism, on superficial level, is comparable to Jainism only to a certain extent. The Tao Te Ching, also known as a Lao Tzu, is an ancient Chinese text traditionally taken as a representative Taoist classic, expressing a distinctive philosophy from the warring states period. It's one of the most influential examples of its genre in its intellectual tradition of China, with hundreds of commentaries upon commentaries written over 2 millennia. If we put together all the chapters in the Tao Te Ching with anti-war themes, we come up with the 3 basic arguments. The anti-cosmological argument: war causes a disruption of the natural pattern of things in the world. Second, the moral argument: preserving life is morally right and killing is morally wrong. Third, the political argument: it is wrong to employ war as a means to political gain, since warfare will inflict great sorrow upon the state and its people, as well as a ruler. All 3 points are presented from both deontological and utilitarian perspectives. The first 2 are made clear in chapter 30, where it says, after a great battle, there is ominous year of famine. The phrase "an ominous year" refers to a year of calamity when farm horses were used as war horses and farmers were drafted to become soldiers. Most commentators took Yuza's statements as a utilitarian economic argument against war, but this statement in chapter 30 speaks not only of war in terms of the disruption of natural patterns of life. It makes an anti-cosmological argument that it claims that nothing is more unnatural than war due to its capacity to disrupt the reproductive force of nature, like farming, leading to the destruction of harmony and social order. When the natural Tao prevails in the war, horses are used in the farm. When the Tao does not prevail in the war horses are bred just outside the city walls. Taoism is against all wars. While it does not elaborate on warfare, its opposition is implied by its worldview. Fan Yanlang, a famous Chinese philosopher, views the preservation of life and the avoidance of injury as a starting point of Taoism. Taoism advocates non-activity or non-intervention. Uvi, for Lao Tzu, whoever acts harms, and whoever grabs lets sleep. Therefore, the sage does not act, and so does not harm, does not grab, and so does not sleep. He compares ruling a big country to cooking a small fish, cautioning against too many changes. For him, if the rich and powerful are arrogant, they will be doomed inevitably. Taoism is skeptical of politics. When King Wei of Chu asked Zhangzi, another famous Taoist scholar, to serve as a prime minister, he turned down the offer. Although Mahism is not well known as other ancient Chinese schools, the Mahis' contribution to the Chinese view of warfare cannot be underestimated. Among all major schools, the most famous indictment of war comes from Mozi. He condemns war on both utilitarian principles and on moral grounds. For him, war does not pay, even for a victor. There is nothing useful about victory. The loss outweighs the spoils. He criticizes the double standard in judging domestic and international politics. His comment on the intention of the state of Chu to attack the state of Song deserves mention. Since Chu possessed abundant land but not a large population, it was unwise to sacrifice what was insufficient for what was superfluous. Moreover, attacking a state that had done no wrong was not benevolent. It was illogical that while killing one person was not allowed, slaughtering whole armies was accepted. Mozi proposes what he called universal love, GMI. For him, partiality in human relations causes all the great harms in this war. He suggests the partiality be replaced by universality. He argues, if men were to regard the states of others as they regard their own, then who would raise up his state to attack, who raise up the state to attack the state of another? Only universal love will make the world peaceful and orderly. Although the Chinese tradition generally stresses the importance of avoidance of war, the notion of just war or righteous war, for the sake of maintaining order in this war, or as a means of justifying legitimate and sanctioned acts of violence, for example, punishing the enemies of the public order, is by no means absent. Mozi takes a position of non-offensive war in the chapter on against aggression, but at the same time articulates the notion of righteous war, contending that the wars initiated by three sages, named Yu, Tang, and Wu, are not to be called attacks, but punishments. In the Mozi, the book of Master Mo, there is a distinction between aggressive attack and offensive punishment. The former deploys forces for the purpose of profit, whereas the later deploys forces for the purpose of preserving the established order. Mencius, the great Confucian thinker, the second in line after Confucius himself, denounces offensive wars. For him, wars involve too many casualties. Death is an inadequate punishment for those who launches war. Those who are expert in waging wars deserve the most severe penalty. He regards all wars in the spring and autumn period as unjust. Although the central authority may wage punitive war against the local ruler, rival states do not attack one another. He argues that boasting of military expertise is a grave crime and that benevolent king has no rivals in the world. This is because he can win the support of the people, even oppressed people in another country. When King Shang of Lan asked how to achieve world peace, Mencius point to unity as solution. When asked who can unify the world, Mencius answers that the one who does not delight in killing can unite it. Not all warfare can be avoided, according to Mencius. Sometimes there are wars that have to be embarked on because they are just. For Mencius, the criteria of whether a war is just lies on how the war would benefit the people of the enemy country. If the people of that country have been starving, freezing, exploited, and abused by their king, then they will welcome the siege. They will not put up any resistance. Instead, they will bring food and drink to reward the incoming troops. So whoever wins, the hearts of the people will win the war. As Mencius says, a human king has no match. Another novel idea introduced by Mencius into Chinese political thinking is the idea of revolution. If the ruler is not humane, if he abuses the people instead of taking care of their welfare, then he can be legitimately thrown or removed. This view may appear contrary to what Confucius teaches, the social-political hierarchy in which the ruler is revered as a ruler, while the subject always remains subject. However, Mencius defended his view by asserting that when the ruler is a lone man, lost by everyone, removing the lone man from the throne is not usurpation. Even though Mencius argues that the validity of rulership depends on the people's acceptance, he does not think that the task of royal replacement should be placed in people's hands. As a specialist in the field, Brown states, Mencius is not a defender of popular revolution. Ideally, he thinks that tyrants should be removed by his own ministers, and among ministers, by those of the old-fashioned kind. The people will not have the political expertise or the military competence to succeed in this task. A revolution initiated by the people will probably bring the whole nation into complete chaos. Therefore, the task should fall on the shoulders of the ministers who originally assisted the ruler. Those ministers themselves have to have some qualifications. They must have the people's well-being in mind and be wise enough to make right judgment. There is only a very slight margin between legitimate overthrow and illegitimate usurpation, and the margin is set by the minister's intent. Confucianism has often been charged with supporting Chinese feudalism, but from what Mencius teaches, we should see that he would never support a form of feudalism that does not include a humane king, prudent ministers, and contented people. We have considered four ancient Asian philosophies that advocate peace. The Jains were absolutely opposed to violence or even harm against any living thing. The Jain philosophical foundational text thus calls for humans to avoid harming other living beings, not because there is an ethical tenet that frowns on such action, but by way of constituting essential to harm oneself. Jiva connects all living beings, humans with those with 2, 3, 4 senses, plants, those with the 5 senses, and the rest of creation. However, since humans have become agents of harm, in this foundational text, practices of animal sacrifice, eating, hunting, entertainment, clothing, and defense are specifically mentioned. Non-harming becomes an everyday task, albeit a difficult one. The Taoists regarded war as a destruction of the natural order and advocated inaction, passivity, or uwe. The Mohis thought war was bad, but sometimes necessary to preserve order. The followers of Mencius thought war was bad, but sometimes necessary in defense of justice. In ancient China, a soldier had no respected rank in the society, but rather the reverse. Good iron, runs in old Chinese proverb, is not used for making a nail. Good man is not used for making a soldier. It was considered a disgraceful thing for a woman to marry a soldier. The warrior was held neither in honor nor in respect. Soldiers were looked down upon by the people. According to Mencius, those who are skillful in fighting should suffer the greatest punishment. The next greatest punishment should be meted out to those who unite princes in leagues against other princes. In the main, the Chinese people have not only hated war, but have condemned whatever might encourage the fighting spirit. Bravery in fighting or fighting and quarreling itself is one of the 5 things which are pronounced unfilal. For such bravery or quarreling would easily endanger one's parents. If a foreign power invaded Chinese territory, what happened? According to the teaching of Lao Tzu, we should not resist the invader. The incomplete will become complete. The curved straight, the empty filled, the old renewed. Apparently, his meaning was, do not resist the invader by force, but by virtue. Thus is incomplete or at fault, in the invader will be completed and corrected. The victor will be vanquished in virtue by the victor. All these philosophies conceive of the world as a place in which all humanity dwells and in which we should all treat one another as equals. The concept of nationalism, in its exaggerated sense, is hardly found in their writings. Universal peace, as a result of enactment of the universal law, of which all past religions and great philosophies were aware. Thus, universal peace is not likely to come as a result of striving for it directly, but more likely as a result of tuning our minds to the universal law, obeying the law, following the right down or path, of which peace is an inherent part. We have a great deal to learn from philosophies such as Jainism and Taoism, Marxism and Mencius Confucianism. In each of them, the moral law is a part of the cosmic law. The human order is a part of the cosmic order. Human justice is a part of cosmic order. All these philosophies are relevant today. Thank you.
Yes. For Professor Schiffer, you mentioned how that with the battles between Prussia and Germany and also with the US and Iraq, the wars keep going on because people want to prove something. And then earlier in class today, we talked about how if absolute kingdom ruled during World War I, they would have stopped in 1915. So do you think with different people in power at the time of the Prussia-Germany fight, would the fighting have ceased earlier? Or was the cry of the citizens too much to halt?
Yeah, but that's a good question. So I'm actually also referring to what my colleague, Dr. Packer said about what propels war forward. So the example I gave of Germany versus Austria is typically an example of a war undertaken for demonstrative purposes, in which the idea of sunken costs, and I'm freely borrowing from your wonderful conceptual toolbox here, the sunken costs don't kick in because it's not a democracy. So, lives have been lost, and so you could, technically, have a population at home that is baying for the victory to be bigger than it is. You know, now let's go on to Vienna, say. But at that point, you know, still looking at a fairly authoritarian society, and the war is being fought by mercenaries. There's a bit of a draft, but it's largely mercenaries. So the idea is, okay, now we're calling it off. And it doesn't matter how many died on this battlefield, the point has been made, and that's it. In fact, you know, what Dr. Pracker said, it also opens up, you know, a nice little field of tension here. On the one hand, you have the sunken costs of war. That is to say, if you have already that many dead, does that force you to go on? Or do you, on the contrary, are you looking at, you know, one thing that democracies have, which is casualty aversion? So, which is it going to be? And you have this field of tension in many modern wars. So, in other words, the question is, if so many have died, is that a reason to go on, or is that a reason to stop? And it can actually work both ways, because you can whip up audiences around the notion of sacrifice. So many have died, therefore we must get something out of this war. Or you can have audiences that say, that's it, enough. You know, like, I mean, the example you gave is Vietnam. You have plenty of examples like that. Charles de Gaulle, at some point in Algeria, that you want us out, we'll get out, because there's not a single Frenchman who still wants to die for this war. So it can work both ways. Yeah, sorry, that's a bit of a long answer to your excellent question, Ryan, but yeah.
Any other questions?
First of all, I'd like to thank you very much for those wonderful presentations and for being here and for contributing to the student clubs or undergraduate clubs. And really appreciate your time and your scholarship, and I want to thank you. I just have a quick question, because I know it's getting late. But in the discussion of, and this really speaks to all of the presentations, especially the recounting of the traditions that honor peace, is why, you know, the question is why do wars happen, given how horrible the costs are to the people close to the fighting. And you've given various models and various explanations and historical examples. But one thing that I was hearing a little bit, especially Schrecker, what you were saying just now, and what Dr. Packer was saying, that the nature of the regime matters, because what seems to occur to me the whole time is that the people making decisions of whether to fight the war are not close to the groups, and certainly not the individuals who are suffering the most in fighting the war, populations as well as military personnel. And so it's the hierarchical nature of the regimes. And I know you were just talking about this, the democracies have a different dynamic, but I wonder if what's really jumping out in the history of war is just the disconnect between those who represent, just disconnect on the scale of interest in populations. So the hierarchical nature of societies and the just inegalitarian distribution of voice and bearing the costs in these locales, so that wars are fought because the people who have to fight them and suffer from them are not the ones either benefiting from them or making decisions to engage in them. So it's a very broad question. And again, you've spoken to it already in your presentations and just now, but could you say something about that?
Well, yeah, and I'll just briefly say that, well, yes and no, because, I mean, as a historian of the First World War, one of the things that jumps out at you is that the people who make the decisions, well, they will not personally be in the firing line, but quite a few of them have sons in the firing line. If you look at all of the governments of the major belligerents, all of them, all those cabinets, all those war cabinets, they are full of men with sons at the front. And many are horribly bereaved. These are absolutely class societies. These are hugely hierarchical societies. but they are fundamentally different from the way that you see wars being fought in the 18th century, where you have, the fighting aristocracy, which is also trying to sustain quite a few casualties, to be clear. But, and then you have the mercenaries. But here, you have this educated middle class, which is suffering disproportionately. I mean, it's the same people that are writing poems to war, that are, and it's the same people that are making the decisions, that are fighting and dying disproportionately. So I mean, that's one huge exception. It can happen, but it can also not happen.
Yeah, I would say that democracy can, in fact, reduce the likelihood of war because, again, people who will do the fighting have more of a say. But also, in World War I is an example of this, the role of whipping up of patriotism. Because patriotism, then the people themselves say, yes, we have to go to war, we have to win. And it is difficult to climb down from that, especially for leaders. And that is one of the reasons why I mentioned that whole notion of strategic withdrawal. Yes, we've gotten into the war, I am leading you into this war, with the idea being it would be short, it will be low cost, and what ended up happening, it was a long, bloody, terrible war. So the people may say, well, the reason why the war is long and bloody is because you were an incompetent leader in fighting the war. So that's the reason why once you get into a war, it's very difficult to get out. And I believe there is some empirical support for this, where once wars begin, they're either in very quickly, or they tend to go on for a while, and until the level of pain is simply so great on society that society changes, and even the old patriotic things no longer work. So again, patriotism whips people up, and it takes a while for that to slowly recede from the public.
I would like to comment. This is a very good question. First of all, when I look at ancient China, and it's these philosophers whom I mentioned, they lived in a beginning or in the middle or at the end. So one of them, representative, it's Mozi. He lived in a time when society was almost in a danger of wiping out. So he, one of the unique philosophers in China, who embraces idea of universal love, because he against partiality. He said that we have to love everyone, because he saw that the danger that people are dying and everywhere, because war in China took almost 500 years, between states. So the problem of maintaining society, that was acutely stood up. So he was a kind of person who went to state, not only trying to dissuade the king to invade, but sometimes he would go and try to help to other states who is in a danger. So they people, they've been like soldiers, like 100 well-organized or 1,000 peasants. They would go and build some constructions to prevent invasion. So that's they were very famous. Even the name Mom, which is originated, it means a tattoo. So he was apparently in prison. So it's really many stories, because China was confronted, and that's why you have another response from Tao or Lao Tzu, the old master. They decided no, non-action. So you have to be just let it go. You have to kind of when wind blows, grasses fall down, and then they stood up. So that's kind of philosophy. That's why he said that we're not going to fight. We're going to we try to escape as much as possible, but we ourselves not going to do that. So their perception, they were so fed up the situation, and this kind of took place. And also, the war in China reminds me what we talk here about happened today. So states were fighting, they were trying to unify, and it was so many states, it was almost 100 states, and they're fighting among themselves. So, and this idea, unification, which was came later on in 221 by Han Facey, who was a legalist, who was reward and punishment. And Chinese people realize that that's not the way we have to go, and the harmony and balance. So it's better to find out solution, to coexist, to live peacefully than engage in a war. So that's it's in terms of cost effect, that was their aim. So you better take care of your neighbor, because this will be eventually brings you profit. So when we see even Chinese today's society become Confucianism, why is that? Because they saw, and psychology and neuroscience tell us their approach, the most effective approach in terms of shaping and in terms of benefit, I guess, in avoiding war. So China always tried to avoid war. So even in 1950s, when Russia, Soviet Union attacked China, so they didn't respond. They just, being called, but they went on a different venue. While Russia, would use power, but they decided that our goal is economic goal, economic revivalism, and it's again. So that's my take. Thank you.
My question is, I guess, mainly directed towards our philosophy professor, but obviously open question. Is there anything in the social science analysis of war that was presented by our political science professor? Is there anything in that in the way of analyzing a single country's kind of cost-benefit analysis and the weighing in on the reasons for war? Why does this kind of like, implying that does it sit on axioms that are contradictory to your kind of last points in your lecture about universal law in which peace is inherent? Is there anything un-universal? Is there something contradictory in the social science analysis about of how we analyze a particular interest? Is that going against what we would think in the Chinese philosophy of a universal law? Is there something particular about this
It's in terms of this Chinese example and Chinese how fit in with the global social science analysis, what you're saying, basically. So social science China, we are started to rediscover China's history and look to analyze from social political view to what extent. But in Chinese writings, that was articulated. For example, when I would say that the Confucians, this whole Confucian scholarship, if I'm answering to your question, so they try to look the benefit and cost of analysis, and it was stated clearly that we shouldn't be engaged in a war. So, but they simultaneously, that's why they are told that it's okay to remove a dictator. It's okay to remove a king or ruler who is not fulfill his duties. But again, it's not the person, not the people. I remember when in Tiananmen Square in 1980s, when it was students were marched against government, they held a sign saying that the mandate of heaven expired. So they believe this law of nature and harmonious, because again, it's a Chinese approach and also approach of Indian philosophy. It's we are one with nature and we're part of nature, and therefore we shouldn't destroy this balance, balance, which is by war we bringing upon ourselves. That's why maybe Jains become great supporters of philosophical movement here in the US and worldwide. So that's one thing I would say. If again I'm answering your question, but it's a broad area, and again today there are a Chinese political philosophy department, which is in Beijing. They are working on comparative models, but not models to, per se analyzing. The social science has outcomes of benefit to what extent Chinese model provides for others. But Japanese took a good example from them, I know that.
My question to all the speakers. So we see the conflict between war and peace in terms of kind of two polar idea. First of all, in the past 3,400 years, I believe, there are less than 200 years that we are in peace. I probably read 2 years ago in New York Times. And there is another tendency that after the First World War I, that there is the Legion of Nations was first emerged, try to prevent wars, and then we have the United Nations after the Second World War that try to prevent war. So there's a conflict between, in historical point of view, war always happened since the beginning of human civilization. From political science perspective, every government have to think about, they have to sustain a regular army force as a strategy, as a necessary strategy. And also there is another force try to say, you guys shouldn't having war with each other, and that is why United Nations, Legion of Nations was forming. So could each of the speakers, from your perspective, answer this question to the conflict between war and peace?
Yes, there's been this strong desire to have peace, especially after the devastation of World War I. World War I, and again, going back to the notion of total war, yes, it was a war of societies. It was devastating. It affected the elites severely. That's one of the reasons why there was such a strong pacifist reaction after World War I, because again, some of the best and brightest in Britain and Germany were killed, slaughtered. So there was this desire to end war. The problem is that, one of the things I mentioned about major powers happen to have interest. And is the world willing, the world collectively, willing to stop certain acts of aggression? So when Mussolini went into Ethiopia was a member of the League. Haile Selassie went to the League, addressed the League while countries being invaded. Are you going to help me out? This is a clear violation of the covenant of the League of Nations. What happened? Not much. Why? Because the major powers, the British and the French at that time, needed Mussolini to, quote, contain Hitler in Europe. That's right, there was a thought that Mussolini could be used to balance off and perhaps contain Hitler. So they said, we might apply some sanctions on the Italians, but not much was done. When the Japanese invaded Manchuria and then China proper, there were a few sanctions and then Japan left the League. The United States was never a member. The Soviet Union attempted to have some type of collective security arrangement, but then that didn't work because there was some concern that, the Soviets are communists and we don't want the communists to gain control. So notice the parochial interests of states oftentimes trump this universalistic desire for peace. And keep in mind, the League of Nations and the UN, these are international organizations. What does that mean? Sovereignty still resides in the states. The League and the UN can only do what the sovereign states allows it to do. There is a Chapter 7 in the UN Charter, which is when the UN says we declare a particular country a belligerent and we, the world community, will go to war against that particular country. Chapter 7, to my knowledge, has only been instituted twice in the history of the United Nations. Once in Korea in 1950, when the Soviets were boycotting, and that's the reason why it passed. And the second time in Operation Desert Storm. That's it. If you can't get the great powers to agree, and great powers have huge interests, you're not going to have
this notion of universalistic peace.
I would tend to, if you regard Earth as a community, I would more tend to regard the situation from the First World War till now as a natural state, is because there's no, I mean, the United Nations should be something, I mean, in the legitimate perspective, somehow power than an individual regime, on an individual state, but actually that legal power is not being established, so there's no order can be secured by this, superficial power. And also, there is the reason I brought up this question is particular about World War I, that both France and Germany tried to finish a war within 9 months, I believe, or 6 months. And both of them tried to finish it earlier, but none of them actually realized their goal. The war ends for years.
Well, look, one thing that is commonly forgotten about World War I is that it started with an invasion.
Sure, yeah.
So, once you have an invasion, you no longer have an observed war. This is something that as historians of the First World War have to deal with very often. Oh, that was an observed war about nothing. Of course it wasn't about nothing. If you just look at where the front isn't in no man's land. The front is deep inside somebody's territory. So the question becomes, once you have an invasion, there's two things you can do. You can indeed take the louder, radical pacifist view that even in the case of an invasion, you do not defend yourself. But there are few examples of societies where that has been followed. And certainly China, when invaded by Japan, most certainly did not follow that precept. And actually the ones that actually tried to spread that thought were people working for the Japanese troops. So there is, it can also be seen as a form of accommodation with an invading regime, which in the long run may or may not produce peace. There are those that point out that if you want peace in the long run, you cannot reward an aggressor. Because if you just give up and say, well, okay, you want this, have it. Rewarding an aggressor can lead to an iteration of war. So, in other words, it may look like something hypocritical that, some wars are fought to get to peace. And it sounds like a hoax. But in the minds of those that make the decisions, and in the minds of those that fight it, it isn't. So people, there are wars that really were fought with the idea that, you bring a rogue state to heel or an aggressor to heel, and therefore you reestablish, and that's something that mentions, if I understand correctly, there is a notion of just war even in mentions.
Yes, but here the question, you raise a very interesting point. China, till 905, was, ruled by, king. So in 1905, king was thrown away, and it was revolutions, and then Japan and so forth. But before that, even in the 12th or 13th century, if I am correct, it was moments when China was took by Mongols. So Mongols, the Kublai Khan or whatever he was ruled in China.
And 1648.
Yes,
and fall of the Qing dynasty.
Yes. So what I'm saying that Chinese culture has another advantages according to other cultures. One advantage of this ancient times, the way war said, Chinese culture is open. So you don't need to be Chinese by nationality. If you embrace the culture, you become one. You see, so it was already in the writings of philosophers. This idea about that if you embrace the culture, if you learn the culture, yes, you become the Chinese. It's not because by your race or by, for example, in lineage, you become. It's a Chinese culture, which is made that Kublai Khan, Mongols, great rulers, and they cohesively or harmoniously existed. So,
but that's typical of early modern empires generally. That they
but
are.
It's still, but still it's persists. And it's not like, for example, when we talk about Japanese culture. In Japanese culture, you are born in a lineage of Amarata, all enough. But in China, it doesn't matter.
Yeah. But to get back to the point about defensive wars
Yes.
versus offensive
Yes.
wars, I think that's a major distinction,
Yes.
which even radical pacifist thinkers are going to make. And they're going to have to go out on a limb.
But you see, Chinese, to that extent, there was all kinds of wars.
Even
Because
defensive wars. Yes.
Even defensive wars, they prefer to be killed rather to go to kill someone. So when I showed the picture of, I don't know if you notice, the naked monk, there are two groups of Jains. One is the Digambara and another is Sutambara. Digambars are those people who are naked or sky-clad. So they are not wearing any clothes and try to put it in a mouse cabin to avoid to even by chance, by accident, to kill any insect. And Sutambara, those white, Sutambars is people who wear white clothes. So belongs to this division. So Sutambars, they also try to obey and try to stay away from, to kill innocents and not eat only animals, but insult someone, So they are really tolerant, and that's why the Jainism, which was spread in China, in India, but never went even to China. Although you find out in China manuscripts of this, work of Jains.
Yeah. Well, you have examples like this throughout history, and it's very interesting, where you have this performative pacifism, which is even going to go as far as martyrdom. The idea being that in the face of this constant cycle of violence, people are going to perform that pacifism and are going to take great risks. And the Christian martyrs come to mind. That's precisely what they did in the face of the Roman state. So this is something that you see. It's typically cycles of violence and cultures of violence and cultures of war will indeed generate this kind of counter. But often it is in the form of a priesthood or martyrdom, etc. It's seldom in the form of something that's going to be able to encompass all of society. But it's true, that is a very interesting, it's something that you see throughout history.
And its impact, if we're going back, so this idea of non-harm was impacted. Tolstoy, whom you nicely mentioned in the beginning of your presentation, so Tolstoy was acknowledged that he was influenced by ideas of Daoism, by the way, Taoism. So
and by Christianity also. I mean, there's a confluence of these ideas. I mean, Tolstoy struggled all his life with questions of war and peace. He himself had been an officer.
Yes,
and a pretty good one. So,
so I'm saying that then you have Martin Luther King here in the U.S., and you have also, which is this idea about peaceful resistance. So it's goes back to Gandhi, but Gandhi was influenced by those Jains because he spent a lot of time. So my take is that these ideas sometimes they go beyond the border and they are in reach and become more something different. Depends on the context. And sometimes they just not stick around because there is no one to catch up and hold on. But ideas of this non-harm, peaceful resistance, which was associated with this Jainism movement, it was really impacted modern war in terms of to stand up in Africa or elsewhere as we can see it.
And it has to be performative. The Edmund Pettus Bridge is, of course, a prime example. That's exactly what's going on.
Well, the problem, however, I would say, is that, yes, it affects individuals across the globe. The problem is, can this become a basis of state policy? Thus, I have to say I'm somewhat pessimistic in terms of its ability to affect state policy, because war is an act of the state. And even the countries where these two philosophies came from, India and China. Let's see, India, which have suffered from war in, 1947-48, 1962, 1965, 1971, 1989, 1991, China, 1950-53, 1962, 1969, 1979, and 1986. Actually, two of the countries that have been the most war-prone since World War II have been India and China, two countries where these philosophies came from. So, although the philosophies are there, the question is to what extent can these philosophies become the basis of state policy? And that's where it becomes it becomes difficult. The philosophies are there, but doesn't.
Yeah, to give one concrete example, one of the most warmongering lobbies in Imperial Germany was the Kant Society. So there.
Dr. Penn, I have to correct you that during the after the Second World War, America is actually the world's most maybe aggressive country in the world. There are 739 standardized military action recorded till now. And for China, the war you mentioned, lots of them are just a particular war, say with India at particular kind of controversial land, or over with Russia that there's also another controversial land. It's within its terrains. It's not outside of this. But it's not the point for me to think about, especially when we raise the question about First World War or the total war, some war concept. The question for me to raise why the peace becomes important is that, say, even though I'm not a citizen of the German or French, I'm a citizen of, say, in the Middle East, I will be affected by this, by their policy, because their war can affect me. That is why the First World War becomes a war, not just two opponents against each other. So my security was kind of affected by others' behavior. So that's why something needs to be done. I think that's why these people, those politicians, try to come up with international organization to prevent war. And that's just probably come back to the basis of this universal. I mean, people hate universal concept, but I also hate it. But since our fate was connected, since our fate was connected, a universal approach might be appropriate to analyze how to secure our safety as a whole.
First of all, let me point out, when you raise this war in 1950, 70, so this is a war happened in the last 19th century. We're not talking about before when officially was Confucian policy was enough. So, and it was Chinese communism was taking place, and Chinese communism was a response. And later, I guess now, leadership realized that was a failure, because they tried to return to their origins, which is their history of Confucianism and others, because Confucian's writings were very true in China. So now, why they recreating? Because they try to acquire their past. So yes, they're a beautiful past, and harmonious past was just not.